The water was running. I could hear it through the open window of my neighbor's house, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat I wasn't supposed to notice. But it was the singing, low, soulful, almost defiant, that stopped me cold in my tracks. I stood frozen on the cracked sidewalk of our quiet Portland suburb, my grocery bags dangling from my hands. It was late summer, the kind of evening where the air smells of cut grass and possibility, and I'd only meant to pass by Harold's house on my way home. Harold, my 60-year-old neighbor, was a mystery wrapped in flannel and solitude. He'd lived next door for 2 years, and I barely knew him beyond his curt nods and the way his eyes seemed to carry a lifetime of unspoken stories. That day, though, something shifted. His voice, raw and unguarded, spilled out through the bathroom window, singing an old folk tune I vaguely recognized. It wasn't just the melody, it was the weight behind it, like he was confessing to the walls. I'm Elias, 62, a retired librarian with too much time and too few people to fill it. I've lived alone since my partner, Marcus, passed 5 years ago, and I thought I'd mastered the art of keeping my heart locked tight. But Harold's voice cracked something open. I set my bags down, drawn to the sound, and before I knew it, I was standing under his window, listening like a thief stealing someone's soul. When the water stopped and the singing faded, I blurted out, "That was beautiful, Harold." My voice trembled, louder than I'd meant, and I regretted it instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, the window slid open, and Harold's face appeared, damp hair, gray stubble, and eyes wide with shock. "Elias? What the hell are you doing out there?" His tone was gruff, but there was a flicker of something else, fear, maybe, or vulnerability. I heard you singing." I stammered, my cheeks burning. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. It moved me. I braced for him to snap, to tell me to mind my own business. Instead, he stared, his expression softening, and for a moment, I saw the man behind the flannel, someone who'd been hiding as long as I had. Harold grunted, shutting the window. But the next day, he was at my door with a thermos of coffee and an awkward invitation to talk. That's how it began. 2 old men, both widowed, both carrying secrets we'd buried for decades, sitting on my porch, unraveling our lives one hesitant word at a time. Harold had been married to a woman named Clara for 35 years. She'd passed 3 years ago, and he spoke of her with a love that was real but complicated. "I was a good husband," he said, his voice low, "but I wasn't honest. Not with her, not with myself." He told me about growing up in rural Idaho, where being gay wasn't just taboo, it was dangerous. He'd buried his truth under layers of duty, work, and a marriage that gave him comfort but never completion. Clara had known, he admitted, her eyes catching his in quiet moments, but they'd never spoken of it. She deserved better, he said, his hands trembling around the thermos. But I was too scared to give it. I listened, my own memories clawing their way up. Marcus and I had been luckier, living openly in Portland for 20 years, but even that came with its scars. Family who stopped calling, jobs we lost, strangers who stared too long. I told Harold about Marcus's laugh, how it filled every room, and how the silence after his death nearly broke me. "I thought I'd never feel anything again," I said, surprised at my own honesty. "But hearing you sing it reminded me I'm still here." We talked until the stars came out, the air between us thick with things we'd never said aloud. Harold's eyes met mine, and I felt a pull I hadn't known in years, a spark of something reckless and alive. But he stood abruptly, muttering about needing to feed his cat, and left me on the porch, my heart racing. The next week, we fell into a rhythm. Coffee on my porch became daily, then dinners in my small kitchen. Harold brought stories of his old construction jobs, his hands rough but gentle as he passed me plates. I shared books I'd loved, reading passages aloud while he listened, his gruff exterior softening with every word. One night, as we washed dishes side by side, our shoulders brushed, and neither of us pulled away. It was small, but it felt like a revolution. Then came the letter. It was slipped under my door one morning, and signed but in Harold's unmistakable scrawl. Elias, I need to tell you something. Meet me in the garden at dusk. My stomach churned. Was he pulling back? Had I misread everything? I spent the day pacing, replaying every moment, every glance. By dusk, I was a wreck, standing in my backyard among the roses Marcus had planted years ago, waiting for Harold. He appeared, his flannel shirt tucked in, his face nervous but determined. I've never done this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not with anyone. But you make me want to try. He stepped closer, his hand reaching for mine, and I felt the world tilt. 62 years old, and I was falling in love again. Harold's hand in mine was warm, calloused, and trembling. The garden smelled of roses and earth, the sunset casting long shadows that seemed to hold us in a fragile bubble. I'm scared, Elias, he admitted, his voice cracking. I've spent my whole life running from this. I squeezed his hand, my own fear mirroring his. I'm scared too, I said, but I don't want to run anymore. His eyes searched mine, and for the first time, I saw him fully, not the gruff neighbor, not the widower, but Harold, a man who'd fought his truth and was finally letting it breathe. We stood there, hands clasped, until the sky turned purple. Neither of us spoke of love, not yet, but it was there, humming between us like a current. Over the next weeks, our lives intertwined. Harold started helping me tend Marcus's roses, his hands learning their delicate rhythm. I cooked him meals, and he'd tease me about my fancy spices, though he ate every bite with a grin. We were cautious, tiptoeing around the weight of what was growing, but every touch, every shared laugh, felt like a defiance of the years we'd lost. Then came the neighborhood barbecue. It was an annual thing, hosted by Sarah, a cheerful woman who lived down the street. Harold and I had always gone separately, blending into the crowd of families and retirees. This time, we arrived together. I felt eyes on us, curious, judging, some kind. Harold's hand brushed mine as we stood by the grill, and I saw him tense, his old fears creeping in. They're watching, he muttered. Let them, I said, surprising myself with my boldness. I took his hand, not caring who saw. Sarah smiled, but others whispered, and I felt Harold's grip tighten. Later, as we walked home, he was quiet, his shoulders hunched. I don't know if I can do this, Elias, he said. Not out there. Not like you and Marcus did. His words stung, but I understood. I'd had years to grow comfortable in my skin. Harold was just beginning. We'll go at your pace, I promised, though my heart ached at the thought of hiding again. That night, he didn't stay for dinner, and I lay awake, wondering if I'd pushed too hard. The next morning, Harold was at my door, his face pale. I need to show you something, he said, leading me to his house. In his living room, he pulled out a box of old photos. Him and Clara, young and smiling, but also letters, tucked away like secrets. They were from a man named Tom, written in the 1970s, full of longing and coded words. He was my first love, Harold said, his voice breaking. We were kids. I broke it off because I was terrified. He died in '82. AIDS. I held him as he cried, his grief raw and decades old. I've been carrying this guilt my whole life, he said. I don't want to lose you too, Elias, but I'm so damn scared of what it means to love you out loud. I didn't have answers, only my arms around him, my own tears falling. We sat there, surrounded by ghosts, and I realized love at our age wasn't just about romance. It was about courage, about facing the world and ourselves. We'll figure it out together, I said, and he nodded, his hand finding mine again. Days turned into weeks, and Harold grew bolder. He'd hold my hand on our walks, ignoring the occasional stare. We started hosting small dinners, inviting Sarah and a few others who didn't flinch at our closeness. But tension was building. Harold's son, Greg, was coming to visit from Seattle. Harold hadn't told him about us, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "He's a good kid," Harold said, "but he's got his mother's traditional streak. I don't know how he'll take it." The night before Greg arrived, we sat in my garden, the roses glowing under the moonlight. Harold's hand rested on my knee, and I felt the weight of what was coming. "Whatever happens," I said, "I'm here." He leaned in, his lips brushing mine for the first time, soft and tentative. It was a kiss that held 60 years of longing, and it broke my heart open. Greg's arrival was like a storm cloud over our fragile peace. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered like his father, with Clara's sharp eyes. He hugged Harold tightly, but his gaze flickered to me, curious and guarded. We sat in Harold's living room, the air thick with unspoken questions. Greg talked about his job, his kids, but his eyes kept darting between us, sensing something he couldn't name. That evening, over dinner at my place, Harold was quieter than usual, his hands fidgeting. I tried to keep things light, asking Greg about Seattle, but the tension grew. When I reached for Harold's hand under the table, he pulled away, his face tight. Greg noticed. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "is there something you're not telling me?" Harold froze, his fork clattering against the plate. I held my breath, waiting for him to speak, but he didn't. The silence was suffocating. Finally, I said, "Greg, your dad and I were together." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Greg's face hardened. "Together? Like what, dating?" His tone was sharp, disbelieving. Harold looked down, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah," he whispered. "I love him." The room spun. Greg stood, his chair scraping the floor. "You're 60 years old, Dad. You were married to Mom for 35 years. And now this." He gestured at me, his voice rising. "Is this why you've been acting weird? What about Mom? What about us?" Harold's voice was barely audible. "I loved your mother. I always will. But this is who I am." Greg stormed out, slamming the door, and Harold crumpled, his face in his hands. I knelt beside him, my heart breaking. "Give him time," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The next day, Greg was gone, leaving a note that said he needed space. Harold was a ghost of himself, retreating into silence. I tried to reach him, but he'd shut down, his fear of losing his son outweighing everything else. Days passed without our usual coffee, our walks, our quiet moments. I felt Marcus's absence more than ever, the loneliness creeping back like an old enemy. Then, one morning, I found Harold in my garden, tending the roses. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. I panicked. I thought I could handle losing Greg, but I can't lose you too. We talked for hours, rebuilding what had cracked. He told me about his childhood, the shame he'd carried, the love he'd denied. I shared my own fears of being too old for this, of loving and losing again. We laughed, we cried, and we kissed, the roses bearing witness. Harold decided to write to Greg, a letter pouring out his truth. He didn't expect a reply, but he sent it anyway, a step toward living honestly. We started going to a local LGBT support group, meeting others our age who'd walked similar paths. Their stories of love, loss, and resilience gave us strength. Harold began to smile again, his hands steady in mine. But the past wasn't done with us. One evening, as we walked through the neighborhood, a group of younger men shouted slurs from a passing car. Harold flinched, his old fears resurfacing. I pulled him close, my voice firm. "They don't get to define us," I said. He nodded, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. That night, he stayed over, and we held each other, the world outside fading away. Weeks later, A letter arrived from Greg. Harold's hands shook as he opened it, and I braced for the worst. But Greg's words were cautious, not cruel. He was confused, hurt, but trying to understand. "I need time," he wrote. "But I don't want to lose you, Dad." It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. Harold cried, relief and hope mixing with his tears. I held him, knowing this was only the beginning of a long road. We kept building our life together, small acts of courage stacking up like stones. Harold came out to more neighbors, some who embraced us, others who kept their distance. We didn't care. We had our garden, our dinners, our quiet nights reading by the fire. Love at our age wasn't a wildfire. It was a steady flame built on trust and time. One evening, as we sat among the roses, Harold took my hand. "I wasted so many years hiding," he said. "But you make me want to live every day I have left." His eyes were bright, and I felt my own tears fall. "I love you, Harold," I said, the words simple but seismic. He smiled, pulling me close, and we kissed under the stars, the world finally feeling right. Months later, Greg visited again. He was still grappling, but he hugged his father, and when he looked at me, there was a flicker of warmth. We ate together, laughed, and for the first time, I saw Harold fully at ease, his past and present no longer at war. As Greg left, he said, "I'm trying, Dad. I really am." It was enough. Our story isn't perfect. There are still stares, still silences from those who don't understand. But every morning, Harold brings me coffee, and every night, we tend the roses. We're two old men, flawed and scarred, but we've found each other in the twilight of our lives. And that, I think, is the truest kind of love, one that dares to exist no matter how late it arrives. What I said to Harold that day, under his window, still shakes me, not because it was bold, but because it was the start of something I never thought I'd have again. A chance to love, to be seen, to live without fear. And in that, we've both found a home.